Now, what does sanctification actually mean? The root meaning of the word means that which is set aside for God. In other words, you're a lost sinner, and I'm a lost sinner, until we come to Christ. Now, when we come to Christ, we've been set aside for His use. Now, you have that in the tabernacle. Back in the Old Testament, you see God was teaching these people these great doctrines through various simple lessons, by the way. Now, in the tabernacle, they had certain vessels and instruments they used in the sacrifices. There were pots and pans, and there were forks and spoons. Now, after they had gone through the wilderness 40 years, why, those pots and pans were pretty well beaten up and battered. I don't think they were very attractive. I think that any good housewife would have said, let's trade them in on a new set, or let's throw these away and get some new ones. But they are called holy vessels. Now, why are they called holy vessels? Because they're set aside for the use of God. That's it. And any person who comes to Christ, he's saved, he's redeemed. Now he belongs to Christ, and he's to be set aside for that. So what Paul means here, and I'll go back now to verse 3. For this is the will of God, even your sanctification. Now you have been set aside for a holy purpose. What do you mean by holy purpose? For God's use. Every child of God, not just preachers or missionaries, or Christian workers, as we call them, full-time Christian workers, but every believer is set aside for the use of God. Now, he says, this is your sanctification. That is, you're set aside now for God. And because of that, that ye abstain from fornication. Now, when anyone today feels that they can engage in sin in any form, and especially the sins of the body, sins of flesh. And in that day, you see, all idolatry had involved in it sex. And today we are seeing the rise of the worship of Satan and Satanism, and all kinds of amulets and rituals and little gadgets. They're used today in certain religious rituals, and that this will bring you good luck. You go and find out through astrology you were born under the sign of the goat, and that means that you're hard-headed or something like that, you know. Well, may I say to you that we have a great deal of that type of stuff, and sex is involved in it. And unfortunately today, every now and then, and too often, by the way, you hear of some Christian worker getting involved, guilty of some sex sins. And unfortunately today, there are certain churches defend ministers who've been guilty of that. And as a result, well, you wonder what kind of lives the members are living to defend that. So you have today this type of thing of people who are supposed to be set aside for the use of God. Now, Paul says you can't do that and be used of God. You can't be a preacher. You couldn't be a singer. You can't be a Sunday school teacher. You can't be an officer in the church. You can't be a worker for God today. And I don't care who you are, you will wreck the work of God if you engage in that type of thing, because you've been set aside for the service of God. Now he goes on here in verse 4, that every one of you should know how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor. And I believe that as far as a child of God is concerned, and we've got a group of people today, they know all about sex, these young people today, and the immorality today is absolutely astounding. A student down in a certain college here in California, I was holding meetings there, and he's a very fine Christian leader, and he holds Bible classes on the campus. He says the boys' dormitory is Sodom, and the girls' dormitory is Gomorrah. He said gross immorality is taking place today. Now, they know all about sex, but they don't know about love. And God is saying here that you should save that body for the marriage relationship, and that would apply to either a man or a woman. And one of the reasons that today there's so much unhappiness in the marriage relations today, they say, oh, they're not sexually mated. I have news for you. It's not a question that they're not related, sexually. The problem is the fact that they are not being faithful one to another. Now, my friend, until that relationship exists, this is your sanctification and your honor, if you please, as a child of God. Believe me, Paul puts it on the line. Now what? That ye should abstain from fornication, that every one of you should know how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor, not in the lust of concupiscence, even as the Gentiles which know not God. Now, all around the Thessalonians were the pagans who mixed up sex and religion. And sex was a religion among the Greeks. You could go to Corinth and find that out, but you didn't have to go to Corinth. You could find it out in Thessalonica. Now he says that you are to live a life today that commends the gospel. May I say that this loose living among believers today, that is, some believers, brings the gospel into disrepute. And I want to say this, it doesn't mean that these folk today are living for God or serving God, for they're not. You cannot serve God and live in sin. He doesn't accept it. He says that, and he makes that clear here. He says you're not to live like that. That no man go beyond, this is verse 6, and defraud his brother in any matter. And you have to be honest if you're going to be a child of God, because that the Lord is the avenger of all such, as we also have forewarned you and testified. And I've lived long enough as a Christian and as a pastor to see this thing worked out in the life of many believers today. And I've seen certain believers who've been dishonest. And you know, God's an avenger, and he moves in and judges them. I've seen it happen again and again.